Hello, everyone. Hey, Josh, have another one ready. We'll do two. Okay. Please stand. Reminder that Man's Day Out is Saturday, 12 and up, 2 to 8. You don't have to be on time. You can leave early if you want. We're going to have fun. Games, cards, guns, explosions, food. Come on out, all right? Sign up is out there, and it's $10 to come and have fun, all right? Thank you. 514, in my heart there rings a melody. I have a song that Jesus gave me. It was sent from heaven above. There never was a sweeter melody. 'Tis a melody of love. In my heart there rings a melody. There rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. I love the Christ who died on Calvary, for he washed my sins away. He put within my heart a melody, and I know it's there to stay. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. 'Twill be my endless theme in glory, with the angels I will sing. 'Twill be a song with glorious harmony, when the chords of heaven ring. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody with heaven's harmony. In my heart there rings a melody, there rings a melody of love. What's the other one we're singing? You can have a seat. What? That one? That's a doxology, I believe. Yes, I know. It's up there too. 604. I want to look at it though. I want to see what that is. I don't know that one. Power in the Blood. That's a good one too. 191. Wait for Nancy to find it. All right. Would you be free from your burden of sin? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you or evil a victory win? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be freed from your passion and pride? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Come for a cleansing to Calvary's tide. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you be whiter, much whiter than snow? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Sin stains are lost in its life-giving flow. There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Would you do service for Jesus your King? There's power in the blood, power in the blood. Would you live daily his praises to sing? There's wonderful power in the blood. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the blood of the Lamb. There is power, power, wonder-working power in the precious blood of the Lamb. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is David Quast, if you didn't know who I was, and me and my wife are Okay, so the passage we're going to be in first is in 1 Samuel, so go ahead and turn there. We'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Okay, 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 through 7. And before I read this, I want to say that there are going to be 3 different examples that we'll see in these passages that follow. And some of them will be bad examples of how people reacted in the face of fear. And then we'll see a good example, and then another good example from another passage as well. Okay, so we're going to see how we can react in these different people and groups of people. So let's go ahead and read. 1 Samuel 13, verses 1 through 7. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, Let the Hebrews hear. And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had an abomination with the Philistines. And the people were called together after Saul to Gilgal. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash, eastward from Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Okay, so here we have our first example of how we can react in the face of a fear. So first of all, what we see in this passage is that Jonathan attacked a Philistine outpost and made the Philistines mad, right? Okay, he attacked them, he got the victory, but it's like disturbing a hornet's nest, right? They just gathered together, and they're getting ready to fight the Israelites. Okay, and we see that Israel is vastly outnumbered. Israel is vastly outnumbered. It's said in verse 2, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. So 2,000 were with him, another 1,000 was with Jonathan, and that 1,000 was what Jonathan used to defeat that outpost. Okay, and more people did come to their aid, but I don't think it was enough to equal the ranks of the Philistines. And also, it says later in the chapter, we won't read it, but the Philistines, they had weapons, they had swords, whereas Israel didn't have that. They basically had farm equipment. It says they had axes and different farm tools that they would use to fight with. The only people that had swords was Jonathan and Saul. They were the only ones. Okay, so Israel is vastly outnumbered. They have inferior weapons, and they are very scared. So it says that they hid in caves and thickets and rocks and high places. They hid in pits, and some of them escaped across the Jordan. So here these Israelites are. They're faced with this obstacle, and their reaction is to run and hide. They are running away from their fears. Now, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with running away from your fears? Their obstacle, that army that wants to defeat them, that's still there, right? Them running away doesn't fix anything. They're just putting it off. They're maybe postponing it for a little bit or hiding from it, but that problem is still there. It's not gone. And they're not trusting the Lord if they're running away and hiding. Okay, so we can do this too. We can hide from our fears. When we're faced with things in our life that we don't want to do, maybe the Lord is asking you to do something. We have a tendency to want to run away if it's not something that we want to do. It's not something that's desirable. That's our first example of how we can react in the face of fear. So let's keep reading. Let's go to, let's keep reading the same chapter, verses 8 through 14. And we'll see another example of how we can react when we're faced with a fearful situation. Okay, it says, and he, that's King Saul, and he, Saul, tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Samuel went out to meet him. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash, therefore said I, the Philistines will come down upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly, for thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. Okay, so let's stop there. Now, in the face of this terrifying situation, Saul doesn't run away like the rest of the people of Israel, does he? He doesn't run away. Instead, he becomes anxious, and he takes action when he shouldn't. Okay? He was supposed to wait for Samuel, but he saw the situation, he saw what was going on, and he just felt like he needed to act. He wasn't willing to wait like the Lord wanted him to. Saul does not wait for Samuel to get there, but also Samuel offers sacrifices. And that's a thing that only a priest should do, right? Saul wasn't a Levite. He wasn't a priest. He shouldn't have made that sacrifice. So Saul let his fear get the better of him, and he became anxious. He took action, but he did things the way that he wanted to instead of waiting for the Lord. Saul took matters into his own hands. And we can do that too. When we're faced with things in our lives, when we're faced with difficult times and we have these fears and anxieties building up in us, sometimes we have this desire to take action and take care of it and get things done. But that's not always what the Lord wants. Sometimes we can even justify doing things that go against his word because of our situation. Okay, so that is our second example of how we can react in the face of our fears. Okay, so both of these are bad examples. Both of these are things we shouldn't do. So now let's look at another passage. We're going to move to the next chapter, chapter 14, and we'll see a good example. Okay, it's the same situation, the same army that's up against the Israelites, but we'll see somebody else who acts in a better way, who trusts the Lord. Okay, so we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 through 23. Verses 1 through 23. Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said unto the young man that bare his armor, come, and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. And Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Geba under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. And the people that were with him were about 600 men. And Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. Okay, so this man was there too with Saul. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. And between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over unto the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on the one side, and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Sina. And forefront of the one was situate northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Geba. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. And his armor-bearer said unto him, Do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee. Behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. Then said Jonathan, Behold, I will pass over unto these men, and we will discover or reveal ourselves unto them. If they say unto us, Tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, Come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be the sign unto us. And both of them discovered or revealed themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, Behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they were hiding themselves. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor-bearer, and said, Come up unto us, and we will show you a thing. And I kind of imagine them saying, Come on up here, and we'll teach you a lesson, you know? Anyway, and Jonathan said unto his armor-bearer, Come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them into the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor-bearer after him. And they, that is the Philistines, they fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer slew after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor-bearer made was about 20 men within, as it were, a half an acre of land, which a yoke of oxen might plow. Okay, let's stop there for a minute. We'll read a little bit further in a minute, but I want to stop and compare Jonathan and Saul here. Okay, so we've seen how both of them have reacted in light of this same situation. Now, Saul and Jonathan both took action, didn't they? Saul didn't run away. He did something in the face of this fear. But Saul acted out of fear and anxiety, didn't he? He acted out of fear and anxiety when he should have waited. Whereas Jonathan, he acted out of trust in his God, didn't he? Jonathan acted out of trust in his God. Jonathan was looking to the Lord as he took action, and he acknowledged that the Lord is the one who would deliver the Philistines into their hands. So, yeah, just as we face things like that in our lives, when we face difficult times, we're probably not going to be faced with a big army that wants to kill us. But when we're facing our fears, it's important for us to remember that our focus needs to be on the Lord. If our focus is on our circumstances, if our focus is on our problems, or even on our own abilities to do something about it, we will fail miserably. But our focus needs to be on our all-powerful God, the creator of the universe, who is able to see us through. Okay, so now that we've compared them to, let's keep reading, and we'll see what the outcome is of Jonathan's actions. Okay, so let's keep reading in verse 15. And there was trembling in the host, in the field, and among all the people, the garrison and the spoilers. They also trembled, and the earth quaked. And I believe that was an earthquake sent by the Lord to send more confusion. That's my opinion on that. So it was a very great trembling. And the watchmen of Saul and Geba of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went on beating down one another. Then said Saul unto the people that were with him, Number now, and see who is gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. And Saul said unto Ahijah, Bring hither the ark of God, for the ark of God was at that time with the children of Israel. And it came to pass, while Saul talked unto the priest, that the noise that was in the host of the Philistines went on and increased. And Saul said unto the priest, Withdraw thy hand. Now, let's pause there for a minute. I think Saul is basically saying, never mind. I'm not going to consult the Lord. Look what's happening. I just need to go. And that's just typical of him based on what we've already seen, right? He didn't want to wait for the Lord. He just wanted to take action because he was anxious and wanted to get something done. Okay, so he says, Withdraw thy hand. And Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves, and they came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow. And there was a very great discomfiture. Maybe I'm not saying that word right, but moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel, which had hid themselves in the Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Beth-aven. Okay, so even in the face of a very fearful situation and impossible odds, Jonathan trusted the Lord and took action when nobody else would, right? The kind of action that displayed trust in his God. It's also important to remember, though, that Jonathan was willing to wait if that's what the Lord wanted, right? He said to his armor bearer, if they tell us to come up to them, then we'll know that the Lord has given them into our hands. But if they don't, we'll know and we'll stay here, okay? Jonathan was willing to wait on the Lord if that's what it took. Even though the people of Israel were cowering in fear, and Saul their king acted hastily in fear, the Lord still honored the faith of one man and his armor bearer and gave the entire nation the victory. Think about that. God gave the entire nation, all the people, that included Saul. He gave all of them the victory because of Jonathan's faith, that one man. He didn't have to do that. God didn't have to do that, but God honored the faith of that one man and gave them all the victory. I just think that's so cool to see the grace of God in doing that for them. When we face difficult situations, we have a few different options. We can run and hide like most of the Israelites did. We can become fearful and anxious like Saul and do things we regret. Or we can step out in faith like Jonathan did, trusting completely in his all-powerful God to give him the victory, even despite all odds. And think about those odds that were against him. He was outnumbered, and he went up there by himself. Can you imagine doing that? I mean, humanly speaking, you would get smashed. He should have been destroyed, but he stepped out in faith because he trusted his God. We all face difficult times in our lives, and we all face fears. We all have them. The question is, where will we place our trust? Where will we place our trust? Now, I do want to take a minute to explain something. There's a lot of emphasis in some church cultures about having faith for the Lord to do things. And, I'm thinking of like faith healings and that type of thing. have faith and the Lord will heal you. But the Lord doesn't promise us that he will always give us what we want, does he? If we say, I have faith that the Lord's going to give me a new car, does that mean the Lord is going to give you a new car? No, right? But if we know what the Lord's will is from his word, we can be confident that he will accomplish that, right? And an example would be like the rapture. God has made promises that he will come back for his church. He will come to rescue us, and we can be confident. We can have complete faith that the Lord will do that, and that will help us to have confidence through this life to live for him. We also know, like from a missional standpoint, we know that it is the Lord's will to reach all the nations of the earth with the gospel, right? We know that from the Great Commission in Matthew 28. And so we can step out in faith knowing that the Lord wants to accomplish that is his will. So that can give us a confidence to reach out, whether that's across the world to a remote tribal group or to your neighbors across the street. We know that it is the Lord's will for you to evangelize them, to get them the gospel. Now, they still have a choice to receive that or not, but we can go forward in confidence that the Lord will be with us and give us the strength we need to do what he's asked us to do. So, now that we've looked at that, we've looked at some different examples. We've seen 2 bad examples of how to react in the face of fear, and we've seen a good example, the example of Jonathan. I want to go and move a few chapters further in the book of Samuel. And we're going to go to chapter 17, and we're going to see another example where most of Israel were cowering in fear, but there was one man who had faith in his God. And I think you all are very, very familiar with it. It's the story of David and Goliath. But I think it's worth looking at again. So let's turn there. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 20 through 27. Okay, 1 Samuel 17, 20 through 27. And, I'm sorry. Okay, verse 20. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath. Oh, I'm sorry. I knew something was wrong. I skipped a whole section. I apologize. We're not going to be in verse 20 yet. We will get there. Okay, sorry about that. Go back up to verse 4. I knew something was wrong when I started. Okay, 1 Samuel 17, and we'll read verses 4 through 11 first. Okay, so, before we start, I just want to give you some context. Israel was again at war with the Philistines, okay, the same people they were at war with before. And David's 3 oldest brothers were in the army. So they were there, they were the soldiers, and the 2 armies were facing each other in battle array, okay? So that's the situation. They're up against the same enemy that they were before. So let's read verses 4 through 11 this time. Okay, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose weight was 6 cubits and a span. Okay, now that would be over 9 feet tall. Okay, imagine that kind of a guy standing in here. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And from what I've looked up, that would be about 125 pounds. And he had graves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders, And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. That would be about 15 pounds. That's just the head of the spear. And one bearing a shield went before him, and he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants of Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Then Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So there's that word again. They're acting just like they did back when they were up against the Philistines before, when Jonathan gave them the victory. And you would think they would learn from what Jonathan did, but they were still afraid. They were afraid of this obstacle, this giant who wanted to kill them. Now, first of all, who should have been the one to go against Goliath? Who should have been the one to stand up and say, I'm going to trust the Lord to give us the victory? We are God's people. We know that he has a plan for us. We know he has made promises to us, and we know that we're not going to be wiped out by these Philistines. Who should have been that one to stand up and say, I'm trusting the Lord to give the victory? Pauline says Saul, and I would agree. We learned from earlier in the book that he was a head taller than everybody else, right? He was probably one of the biggest guys in the army, and he had a lot of battle experience, and he was their leader. So if anybody is going to go up against this giant, it should have been him. But he was afraid too. This time Saul didn't even take action. He was with the rest of the Israelites, cowering in fear. He didn't want to go up against him. Every morning and every evening, Goliath would come and present his challenge, but he had no takers. Nobody would go up against this man. Now, at this time, David is back home taking care of his father's sheep. Now, before this, David was ministering to Saul, if you remember. He would play the harp for him, and it would soothe Saul, it would calm him down. And so David was with Saul part of the time, but for whatever reason, David is back home with his father again, tending his father's sheep. So Jesse decides to send David to bring supplies to his sons and their army commander. Okay, so let's pick up now where I started reading before in verse 20. 1 Samuel 17, verses 20 through 27. And David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran unto the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him. They were sore afraid, and the men of Israel said, Have you seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. So in other words, we've already told you. What we already told you is what the king will do. Now, let's look at David's attitude compared to the rest of Israel. Everyone else, they were cowering in fear. They would run away when they even saw this man. Nobody wanted to go up against him. But what does David say? When he's talking with them, he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" You see, the Israelites, most of them were focused on Goliath. They were focused on their fear. They were focused on that obstacle. But David wasn't. He wasn't paying attention to Goliath. He was looking to his God. And compared to his God, Goliath was nothing. And he says, "Who is this man that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David's focus was where it should have been. Israel, they were caught up in what was going on around them. They were caught up, focused on their fear. So we can do that too. We can be caught up in the things that are causing us to fear. We can let that consume us. We can give in to those fears, and that will control us. But if we are willing to look to our God for strength, look to him and recognize that he is the one in control, man, that makes everything else melt away, doesn't it? Okay, so we're going to go to our last passage of Scripture that we'll read for the night. And this is probably my favorite passage that we'll read tonight. So we're going to go through it, and then we're going to go back and look at some things in here and see David's attitude in this situation, okay? So we're going to read 1 Samuel 17, verses 32 through 51. 32 through 51. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." And David said unto Saul, "Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing that he hath defied the armies of the living God." David said, moreover, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." And Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass on his head. Also, he armed him with a coat of mail, and David girded his sword upon his armor. And he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them." And David put them off, and he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, "Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowl of the air and to the beast of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowl of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and with spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Now, let's go back and re-examine some of this that we've read. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is in verse 33. And David is talking with King Saul here. And what is Saul's attitude? What is Saul's attitude when he hears what David plans to do? He said, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth and a man of war from his youth." For thou art a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth. So, again, King Saul was looking at the circumstances. He was focused on this thing he was afraid of. And he was looking at David. You know, humanly speaking, he was a young boy, right? He was a young kid. And Saul is thinking, this kid, David, he's never been in battle. You know, he's tended sheep and scared off some animals, but he's a boy. He's going to get smashed by this Philistine. Saul was looking at his circumstances, and he was not trusting in his God. Now let's look at David's response. David didn't get discouraged by what Saul said. And here's what he says. He says, "Thy servant," in verse 36, he says, "Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God." See, David had his focus where it should have been. He was focused on his God, and he knew that the people of Israel were God's chosen people. He knew that God had a plan for them. He knew about the promises that God had made to bless the world through Abraham's descendants, right? God made that promise to one of David's ancestors. And David knew that that can't happen if the Philistines wipe them out. So David was able to go against this Philistine with confidence, knowing that God was going to give him the victory, because he knew that God had to keep his promises to the nation of Israel. Okay, now let's move on down, and let's look at David's interaction with Goliath now. So let's jump down to verse 43. The first thing I want to mention is that the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Okay? This Philistine had belief in gods, just like David had belief in his God. The difference is David's God is real. He is the creator of the universe. Goliath's gods are nothing. They are false gods. They're fake gods. And they have no power against the almighty creator of the universe. And David knew that. So these curses that the Philistine made, that Goliath made, didn't faze David. Then Goliath said, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the earth." Okay, so Goliath has confidence that he will defeat David. But where is Goliath's confidence? Goliath's confidence is in his own abilities, right? Goliath's confidence is in the fact that he is bigger than everybody else, that he has armor and some pretty cool weapons, and he thinks he's just going to smash David, because David has no armor, he doesn't even have a sword. Goliath was focused on his own abilities, and David, his focus was on his God. Now let's read what David's response is to Goliath, okay? We're going to start halfway through verse 45. David says, actually, let me just read the whole verse. Then said David to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear," okay, and with a shield. And that's what Goliath was trusting in. "But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hands." David recognized that Goliath was trusting in those things. And David knew that his God was more powerful than Goliath's weapons. David knew that his God was more powerful than this giant that he was standing before, no matter how scary and fearsome he looked. Now let's read a little bit further. We'll pick up where I left off there. And David says this, "I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." Okay, so David uses the same terminology that Goliath did. Goliath threatened to give David's carcass to the birds and the beasts of the earth, right? But David ups the ante. He says, "I'm not just going to give your carcass to them. I'm going to give the carcasses of the whole Philistine army to the beasts of the field and the birds." David had confidence in his God to do even more than what Goliath was claiming to do. Okay, and then I love what I love what David says next. I love what David says. He says, "That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." That's David's motivation. That's David's motivation in this. He says, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David wanted everybody, not just the Philistines, not just his own people. He wanted everybody to know that there was a God in Israel and that he is more powerful than any other God. Goliath mentioned his gods. He tried to curse David with his gods. But David was about to show that his God, the God of Israel, was more powerful than anybody else, even the gods of these other people. And he wanted to display that to all the earth. David had a missions mindset. He wanted everybody to have faith in his God, and he wanted to do that through this situation. And David goes on in verse 47, he says, "And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Here again, we see David's confidence. He wanted everyone to know that it doesn't matter how big your army is. It doesn't matter what weapons you have. It matters who you serve. It matters who your God is. Amen. And then, down at the end of 48, when it's time to go into battle, what does David do? It says that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He ran toward the army, or toward the Philistine. And I'm just thinking, how many times am I willing to do that? You know, how many times am I faced with something that I'm afraid of, that I'm willing to run towards it? Am I that anxious to face it? But David was. He had absolute trust in his God despite all odds, and he ran towards towards this obstacle in his life, this fear, this potential fear. And then let's jump down to the bottom. The very last words that are read, I'm skipping a little bit here, but we know what happens, right? David gets the victory. He kills the Philistine just like he said he would. And then when all of the Philistines see that Goliath is dead, this one that they had hoped in, what do the Philistines do? It says that they fled, right? They ran away. Goliath was just one man in their army. They still had the whole rest of their army that they could fight Israel with. But when they saw Goliath was dead, they ran away. They ran in fear. Now, why did the Philistines do that? Why did they run in fear? And here's what I think. I think it's because they just heard a little boy. They heard a little boy boast about his God and how his God would give him the victory. And then they saw God work through this little boy. They saw God work through this little boy to defeat the very one they had put all of their trust in, and that is Goliath. That is why they ran away. They recognized that Israel's God is very powerful. They saw something happen that should never have happened, humanly speaking. This little boy, without military experience, going up against this giant of a man who is fully armored with a sword and a spear. They see David kill him with a rock. They recognized the power of Israel's God, and they were scared, and they ran away. Because David trusted God, and he was willing to step out in faith, he displayed to everyone, the Philistines and his own people, the awesome power of his God. I don't know what fears you all have today, but I do know that we need to remember what God we serve. We all, every one of us, we all serve the God that David served, that same one who gave him the victory. That is our God. And he wants to do amazing things in our lives. We serve the all-powerful creator of the universe who can do anything just by saying the word. He wants us to trust him and to step out in faith, especially when everyone else thinks it's crazy. He wants us to step out in faith, especially when everyone else thinks it's crazy, because that is when it is the most obvious that it is God who is working and not us. Amen. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word, that we can learn from it, that we can be motivated and just be in awe of your awesome power and your ability to displace fear in our lives. I pray that we would trust you as we go throughout this week, whatever we face. I pray that we would remember who you are, that we would not focus on ourselves or our own abilities to accomplish things. I pray that we wouldn't trust in our government. I pray that we wouldn't trust in money. I pray that we wouldn't trust in our own abilities, but in you. Lord, we love you, and we thank you for this day. In your name we pray. Amen.